Hi, my dearest of family. Today we are going to be looking at the fifth card of the major arcana, which is called the Hierophant, sometimes also called as the Pope or the High Priest card. So this card represents the seeker of wisdom, traditional structures, education, spiritual guidance. While the Emperor focuses on worldly power and law, the Hierophant focuses on the power of organized beliefs, institutions, the transmission of knowledge from teacher to student. So therefore, this card is very traditional. It has got a respect for established rituals, customs, conventional social norms. It represents education, formal instructions, mentorships, the passing down of established wisdom to others, institutional alignment, so working within a structured organization such as church, school, a company, rather than forging an entirely new path. And also it shows conformity as well. So it's about kind of sticking to group standards and seeking approval from authority figures or even communities. Now, some people work with upright meaning, some people work with reversed meaning. I'm not going to be telling you to do that or not to do that. But if it's upright card, usually it represents the positive side of things. And then if it's a reversed card, then that might be shows more of a rebellion kind of like nature against tradition or a rejection of established norms. And maybe you are questioning the institution that previously guided you, or feeling stifled by really rigid structures, and so on. So now we see a lot of symbols on this card, and obviously, these videos are more to do with trying to tie astrology together with the tarot cards. So when we look at the astrological connection, the Pope would represent somehow the sign of Taurus. The element would be the earth. So obviously, earth signs are very practical. It's about manifestation. It represents the material world. And Taurus is a fixed sign. So we can see on the card that this is definitely a fixed position because we have got the Pope sitting also on a throne. So it shows stability, endurance, persistence, preservation as well. And because it would be a Taurian card, so the planetary ruler would be Venus, which actually represents the values, harmony, and resources as well. So, what would be the connection between the Pope and the Taurus? Well, it's the stabilization of the belief. So, Taurus is considered with the creation of lasting forms, security, the physical manifestation of resources. Similarly, the Hierophant is the institutionalizer of the spirit. So it takes the abstract, kind of like lightning bolt inspiration of the magician, for example, or the intuition, the internal guidance of the high priestess, and codifies them into rituals and educational structure that can be obviously passed down reliably to others. Some people might say that this would be more of a Sagittarian card, which I disagree with. The reason being is because we can see a lot of fixed elements on this card. So, firstly, um, I often say that we tend to be looking at the belief systems from a ninth house point of view. But I also believe that the second house does represent the belief system as well. But that's the difference would be between the two houses, that the second house is a little bit more to do with belief systems that got passed down from our parents to us. And the ninth house is the belief system that we create through experiences. So, when the Pope pops up in a reading, it's rarely about spontaneous change because it's a very fixed energy. It's a fixed sign of Taurus, right? So it does represent a resistance to change. This card prefers to maintain what is already proven to work. So if this card kind of like appears, often it appears because we are kind of like stuck in a rut, especially when it's in a downward position. This is the energy, like this is how we have always done it. This is the way I was told by my parents to complete things. Now, Taurus is deeply sensory and material, and the Hierophant reflects this in the emphasis on the physical tools of religion and education. The heavy robes, for example, the stone buildings that you can see on the cards, the books, the candles, the incense. So it is a practice of spirituality, but through sensory engagement. So when the Pope appears in a reading alongside maybe in someone's chart who has got a Taurus placement, then often those people are very certain about certain things. For example, they want to be fitting into a system, like they want to be part of a corporate training, a religious initiation, or following a specific school of thought, for example. This card is about legacy. Taurus is about the desire to build something that lasts, but it's relying on the inherited knowledge rather than the pure innovation. And often Taurus is about comfort. So it's about finding security in the ritual itself rather than the outcome that would become the most important. Now, of course, we might want to be looking at how we got from the emperor to the pope. It's kind of like a bit of a progression, right? So the emperor was card four, which I made a video about. And then now we are in card five. So that's an evolution from kind of like a secular organization to more of a spiritual institutional initiation. So while the number four was about the law of the land, we are moving away from that and then we are moving towards the law of the spirit. So the Pope or the Hierophant is a very spiritual card, actually, even though it might not be coming across when you look at the card, from a first glimpse. In the Emperor card, we have established a physical kingdom. And then now you need the philosophy, you need the belief system, you need the formal method to maintain that cohesion of that kingdom. And this is exactly what this card is going to represent. For me, the Emperor is about the structure of reality, the wars, the laws, the hierarchy. The Hierophant actually provides the meaning behind that reality, the ethics, for example. So, of course, both card in a way is a bit more material, but the Hierophant is already getting in touch with its spiritual side as well. While the Emperor was very much focused on how to survive and how to lead the country, maybe to victory, the Hierophant is very much focused on how to believe and how to belong to others as well. The primary need of the emperor is about security and control, while the pope represents the meaning and the connection. The emperor is the king, the state, the governor, pretty much, while the hierophant is more the teacher, the institution itself. So we are moving from this physical safety to this spiritual security because, like I said, the Hierophant is a Taurus card. The safety is there, but it's more about spiritual safety. With the Emperor, we establish certain type of boundaries, typically for survival. And once those boundaries are set, the house is built, then the human psyche naturally looks for something to fill that space. So we need to know where we are in relation to the universe. It's kind of like you are searching for the meaning to life in a way. The Emperor was a bit of an Aries energy, like we said, right? Or some would consider it more Capricornian. The Hierophant is more of a Taurus energy, so that's where the ceremony, the tradition, the slow, steady transmission of knowledge comes into the picture. So this would be the development between them two. Now, we can see a lot of similarities actually between the emperor and uh, and the hierophant, right? So we can see, for example, that both of them are pretty much sitting on a throne, which visually establishes their status as figures of authorities. However, the way they are sitting on that throne tells two completely different stories about how the authority is actually applied. You know, the throne is very much kind of like the institution, the sign of institution or the sign of office. So it signifies that the authority being displayed is not just personal, but sanctioned by a higher order. So when we compare these two thrones, pretty much, the emperor's throne is a bit more about the throne of action. His throne is usually depicted in an open uh, space surrounded by mountains, a bit of a rugged landscape. So it represents the high ground. It represents the pinnacle of the material world. It is open because it somehow wants to show that this king is actually looking after the entire nation. It also shows that authority is active, protective, constantly engaged with the outside world. Now, when we look at the Pope, that's more of the throne of reception. His throne is usually situated between two stone pillars, often inside a temple or kind of like a structured enclosure. So he's not out there in the world, right? The world comes to him. So it's still an authority figure, but it's more internal, more protected, more kind of static. So, also when you look at the posture, the emperor, his posture is more tense, upright, ready for movement. So that represents that he is the doer. His throne is pretty much of a place of a command. But when we look at the Hierophant, his sitting posture is formal, ritualized, very static. So he's a bit more like a transmitter here. His throne is more of a place of holding, where he serves as a vessel for knowledge and tradition that remain potentially unchanged. So the emperor is the authority of the external world, while the Hierophant is the authority of the internal world. Now you can see on this card that he's sitting between two pillars, which is actually very interesting because the High Priestess is also sitting between two pillars. If you remember card number 2, I also made a video about that in case you want to be checking that out. So the pillars are the guardian of thresholds. However, the type of threshold they guard is entirely different. Because one leads to internal mystery, the other is about external consensus. So what really happens is that the two pillars are kind of like the representation of a gateway. The figure seated between them acts as a gatekeeper who controls access to what lies behind. So because we have got two pillars on the High Priestess card, it feels like that is the representation of the duality of the veil. It was a B and J pillars, if you remember. And in the Hierophant's chart, it represents the structural walls of the temple and institution as well. In the High Priestess card, the pillars are the representation or the threshold between consciousness and the unconscious. While in number 5, that's the threshold between the profane world and the sacred dogma. The High Priestess was more mystical. So those were about pretty much subjective truth. In the Hierophant's chart or card, it's more dogmatic. It's about more of an objective truth, really. So in the High Priestess card, the pillars represents the limits of the human perception. She sits in front of the veil, guarding the mysteries that cannot be explained by language. You don't join the High Priestess, you attune to her. You don't question her, you just kind of believe her, right? She just represents that silence and more intuitive kind of like knowing that occurs before any system is actually created. Now, the Hierophant is an external gateway. So the pillars represents the limits of the society or the limits of the religious order. And he sits inside the temple, guarding the mysteries that must be articulated through language, rituals, and texts. So, you join the Pope, for example, if you need baptism or you need guidance, certain type of education, or you want to talk to them about your sins, for example, or mistakes that you made. So he actually represents the voice of the collective and the known wisdom that is handed down, to preserve the order pretty much. So that's one. Now, we can also see on the card that he has got two keys underneath the throne. And, that's also a very interesting iconography. I mean, in Rider Smith imaginary, one is often gold and the other one is often silver, which is also somehow showing us duality. Also, it shows as a bridge between the divine and the human nature. So the two keys typically crossed are the traditional embers of Saint Peter, representing the authority to bind and to loose as well. So in the Tarot, they symbolize that specific power that this Pope has, the ability to act as a gatekeeper between the sacred and the profane, which is the material world, right? So the gold key would represent the conscious, kind of like the waking mind, the logic, the light of day, really. While the silver key would represent the subconscious, because silver is the moon color, right? It's the representation of the moon. And moon is about the subconscious, while gold is the representation of the sun, and that's more about the conscious self. So the silver key represents the intuition, the subconscious, the mysteries of the night, really. So the gold is the conscious flow, and the silver is the subconscious truth. So one is a little bit more inner, while the other one is a little bit more external, really. So why are those keys at his feet? Because he has already mastered them. He doesn't need to hold them up or use them constantly. He rests upon them. So imagine that you have got this reading coming up with a client of yours with this card. It might represent that they have got the keys, they have got the answers already that they need, but maybe they just don't see it yet. Um, Unlike the high priestess who hides the mystery behind the veil, the Pope offers the keys to those who are initiated into his order. So he regulates who gets to learn what and when. So if the keys appear in a question about, let's say, access, the Hierophant suggests that the seeker needs to gain the correct credentials, follow the standard procedure, or approach the gatekeeper, who is kind of like the mentor, the organization, the tax man, or whoever it is about, right, to obtain the solution. Now, with one hand, he is holding the pillar. With the other one, he's actually holding, you can see a kind of a symbol, right? So that's also actually very important. This is actually where pretty much the work of the Hierophant happens. Because we discussed already, the pillars provide the frame of his authority. His hands are the tools he uses to transmit that authority to the seeker. So, or in some tarot cards, actually, he's not necessarily holding the pillar. He's kind of like gripping the pillars, really, or he sits so closely between them that his raised hand acts as like a living bridge between those two structures, really. But the right hand, which is the gesture of benediction, his right hand is raised with two fingers pointing up and two fingers pointing down. Often those two fingers are actually touching the palm as well. So this is something to do with blessing, really. It represents or signifies the Hermetic principle of as above, so below. So often this card also can appear in readings when karma comes around and goes around. It feels like that this is kind of like a conduit. So he takes that spiritual, abstract, or divine laws, which is obviously above, and grounds them into that material human reality. So this card is about teachers. It's kind of like the connection between a teacher and the student. This card kind of represents that a teacher is able to explain really complex, esoteric concepts, for example, in a way that becomes really understandable to the student. Now, when we look at the left hand, we have got actually basically it's a triple cross. It's called as a papal cross or a triple cross. And this represents dominion of the church over three realms, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So basically the body, mind, and the spirit. Because he holds this stuff in his other hand, it implies that his authority is not just spiritual, it is also administrative or organizational. So he has got the power to kind of govern the collective, to govern a person, basically. So that left hand is the representation of institutional power, the governance of body, mind, and the spirit. Um, what else do we see on that card? We can see two people also underneath him as well. They are the initiates. They are the acolytes. They are kind of like monks there. And this symbol is actually also super vital to the card's meaning, as well, what really happens is that, a pope cannot exist without the initiates. So if he were alone, he would just be, a static idol. So the presence of those two figures proves that he is an active teacher. So they represent the bridge between the high abstract knowledge of that institution and the human need for guidance, really. And like the pillars, the two figures represents duality as well, because we have got two of them. And one again is the representation of conscious, and the other one is the subconscious. So the seeker approaches with both their kind of waking analytical mind and their hidden kind of like intuitive nature. And then it's going to be up to the person whether we are going to be believing the Pope or we are not going to be believing that, right? But those two people are the representation of the common people who need the institution to help them bridge the gap between their daily lives and the divine energy. They are on their knees, and that shows surrender. It's more to do with the surrender of the ego rather than the self. So to receive the keys or the blessing, which we have discussed earlier, they must first be willing to become a student. So it represents a way humility as well. And then you can see the garments as well. So their clothing is often embroidered with symbols of roses and lilies, which is often the symbol of passion and purity, innocence as well. Um, so when you look at the robes, of those monks, or we can call them as acolytes as well, like I said, those are roses and lilies. So the roses, red roses, which represents passion, desire, the material world, they are actually symbolizing also that earthly nature of the student, their attachments, their emotions, their physical existence in the material realm. And the lilies are white, so they represent that purity, intellect, the spiritual realm. So those are actually the representation of these initiates' potential for higher consciousness, the clarity of mind, the connection to the divine. So you can think of the Hierophant, for example, as a card which represents that you need to be attending a retreat. You are somehow breaking away from the physical world to kind of recharge your batteries, for example. It's very important to understand that these students are not discarding their humanity to become spiritual at all. They're just somehow bridging the entirety of their being, you know. It's about bringing the two worlds together. And the role of the Pope, you know, is not about asking them to choose between the rose or the lily. His role is to provide a structure that allows both aspects of that human experience to coexist and then thrive, but in a very balanced, kind of sacred way. So that's also an important one. What's also important to mention that the lilies and roses have appeared on the High Priestess card as well. So, or at least the floral symbolism is on both cards as well. Um, well, in some cards on the High Priestess card, it's more to do with pomegranates and palm leaves. But in some other cards, it's also roses and lilies as well. Either way, there is a pattern here, right? So we have got certain type of flowers, a botanical language to these two arcanas. And it just, again, like I said, they are the representation of the human consciousness and how it can be elevated. You know, the high priestess, it's more of an internal garden, really. So it shows our internal potentials. While with the Hierophant, you know, these are a little bit more worn directly on the robes because they have made certain type of steps towards that consciousness. In in the High Priestess card, we can't really. We're still looking for the meaning to life. Here we have found something, but we haven't gotten there yet. Now it's number five, right? And number five is often called the number of human and the bridge. So number five is, you know, it was interesting with number four because that was the square element, right? So it represented stability, the four directions, the four elements, the four seasons. You know, number five is the square plus the center point. So it takes the four corners of reality and adds the human element to the center, kind of like creating a bit of a pentagram there. So the number five represents the human being, four limbs and one head, pretty much. So it is the first number that truly represents the individual human experience. Five is actually an unstable number. It already introduces certain type of changes or the need for a system to handle that change as well. So often we start questioning certain type of belief systems with this card as well. You know, number five, think of the five senses. Well, that's such a Taurian connection, right? So it is not just about believing, it is feeling, hearing the chanting, seeing the robes, and so forth. So that's why this card is highly spiritual. That's why we have got someone here who can actually put it into words. That's why this is a spiritual card. That's why this card represents astrologers and tarot readers and all those type of stuff. Also, how many fingers do I have? I've got five fingers. So that's five fingers represent the gesture, the blessing as well. So let's have a look at some examples. What happens when we draw this card, for example, in some scenarios. So what happens if we have got this card in a professional or career matter? You know, then this card is surely pointing towards the institution. It is not a card of being a solo entrepreneur, or it's not necessarily a disruptor role. It's about working our ways up towards becoming a hierarchy. So it represents corporate environments, formal training, mentorship, certification courses. It's pretty much a card of a long-term career path. It might be showing up when you have to be able to follow the protocols or certain type of standard operating procedures. And this card might be popping up if you need to seek out a mentor or a senior figure who has already done it and then get their advice. Maybe this card could be popping up that you need to consider formal education or a certification course to be able to move up the ladder. This card often pops up actually when we get promoted or when we have got a desire to get promoted, we just don't know what exactly to do. Now, what happens in relationship questions? Then this card is about formalization. It would represent that the relationship is moving toward a recognized status. So commitment, marriage, engagement, keeping family traditions, seeking the approval of the parents or seeking the approval for this union. This card also can pop up if we have to be able to focus on shared values. So if you are struggling in a relationship, maybe this is saying to us that we need to look for a couples counselor or a mediator to provide kind of like a structured path forward. But if the relationship thrives on spontaneity or non-conformity, this card can actually signal that the relationship has become too stiff, or this relationship is burdened by traditional expectations, parental expectations. So this could be also popping up in divorce as well. Now, what happens in a relocation question? Talking about relocation, I'm going to be having a 16-week relocation course coming up. So you might want to check out the syllabus on my website, AstroViktor.com. But this course is designed to make sure that you can pick the best place ever for you to live a happy life. But from a relocation point of view, this could be an indication that you need to be moving to a place where there is a strong community, for example, or there is a historical significance to that place, or a structured environment, maybe a more established neighborhood, a place near family, or a city with a very clear cultural identity. So it's about you wanting to find a place which provides security, a sense of belonging. So this card would pop up, for example, oh, shall I relocate? And then this card pops up and it says, no, you have to do a bit of a research. You cannot just, it's not time for kind of like moving to the middle of nowhere where you don't have information about. This is about integrating the pre-existing stuff into your new life, basically. So yeah, that's pretty much the Hierophant. So do let me know what Hierophant or the Pope or the High Priest actually means to you. I would love to hear your opinion about this card. And I hope to see you in my next video. Take care. Bye-bye.